All right, I would like to welcome everyone to the Public Planning Committee for Thursday, April 22nd, 2021. I'd like to call the meeting to order. Teresa, are we in compliance with FOIA?
Yes, sir, we are.
Thank you very much. Teresa, please call the roll.
Ms. Becker?
Here.
Mr. Brown?
Present.
Mr. Stanford? Mr. Ames?
Here. I'd also like to recognize that Councilman Tom Lennox is also with us, and I'd like to welcome Michael Gentleman, Kathy Voss, and also Todd Theodore, who will be participating later on in the meeting. Is there a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
And a second? Thank you. All those in favor, just raise your right hand, please. It passes unanimously. Thank you. Approval of the minutes. Any comments, deletions? If not, a motion to approve.
I was absent, so I can't vote on it.
Okay.
I will move to approve the minutes.
Is there a second? Okay. All those in favor, please raise your right hand. Okay, that's 3-1 with one abstention, or 3-0, one abstention. Thank you. Teresa, have there been any requests for public comments?
No, sir, we have no callers on the line. However, there were public comments submitted on the portal, and those comments were provided to the committee this afternoon.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. There is no unfinished business, but there is new business. It's a discussion related to the Design Review Board concerns regarding building massing, height, setbacks, and buffers. As I said, Michael Gentleman, chairman of the DRB, and Kathy Voss, vice chairman, are with us, as well as Todd Theodore, who is on the LMO committee, is an LMO committee member, planning commission member as well. I would like to make a couple of opening comments. I was on the LMO rewrite committee that came out of the mayor's task force on the island's future. Most of the work we did was in 2012, 13, 14. I would make the observation that at that time, we were very concerned at the lack of investment in the community and the development activity. I think you could summarize by saying it was a dramatically different environment than we are experiencing today. I would also make the observation that the LMO committee was trying to do its best without a lot of research behind it or a land use plan for the island. We were basically looking at the current zoning and also the current uses on the property and trying to figure out if there was a way that by amending the LMO, we could stimulate investment. Over the period of the subsequent intervening years, there have been a number of occasions when citizens have expressed concern about some of the buildings that were being built. I've been involved as a observer of the Design Review Board over the last several years and have witnessed the frustration that occurs periodically with the DRB trying to do the best they can to respect the guidelines that they have been given and depend on to make their rulings, and the products that our LMO allows. And I think that's where we are today, to try to figure out how to deal with the inconsistencies between what the LMO allows and what the island character guidelines that the DRB depends on. Having said all that, Chris Darnell, would you like to make a presentation by staff?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the context And what I'd like to do is provide some context for the discussion to follow. Teresa, can you pull up the presentation, please? Okay. What I'd like, again, talking about context, because it's all critical in this discussion. I'm going to run through each of the projects that have raised some concern for the DRB members. I don't want to put words in their mouth. They can speak afterwards. But my hope is just to kind of give everybody an idea of what we're talking about so that we're all sort of on the same page. To that end, before each project, we'll have sort of a location map so that you'll understand where it is exactly. On this location map, you can see Coligny Circle in the upper right-hand corner, and then running diagonally towards the lower left-hand corner is South Forest Beach. The site, Ocean Oaks, is outlined in red here, and you can see the beach and the ocean towards the bottom right of your screen. Does everybody understand where we are? And if you don't, would you please let me know? Okay, not hearing or seeing anybody. Was that somebody that didn't understand where we were?
No, I was just saying, go ahead.
Okay. Teresa, next slide, please. This is a site plan for the Oaks, and I would point out just left of center is South Forest Beach Road. You'll notice the two short dashes, long dash represent the property line. From that line to the dash line is the buffer requirement. You'll notice that the parking lot is in front of the building here. It's my understanding that the developer opted to put the parking in front of the building and eliminate any need to step the building back. So he was able to get just a straight facade, vertical facade, because of the parking, pushing the building back and eliminating any interaction with that angled setback that's on South Forest Beach. Teresa, next slide, please. Okay, here you can see an elevation of the building through potential buffer plantings as viewed from South Forest Beach. Teresa, next slide, please. This is an elevation of the building from the left-hand side. So down in the bottom right, you can see the porte cochere entrance. It's important to note here that the building height here is measured not from the ground, but from the flood elevation. Teresa, next slide, please. So moving on to 11 Mitchellville, what we're calling 11 Mitchellville, it's a more recent DRB approval. You can see Bagall Road coming up from the bottom left corner and Mitchellville running sort of diagonally across the middle of your screen from upper left to lower right. You can see the spa there in the bottom right corner, which accesses onto Beach City. Does everybody know where we are? Okay. Not hearing or seeing anybody. The site is outlined in red. Teresa, next slide, please. So you can see the site plan here. I would note the location of the building to the property line. That was an issue or was a major part of the discussion during the DRB meeting. Next slide, please. So here you can see the front elevation at the top of the proposed building, and the lower elevation is the right-hand side. Also note that there are two buildings that are separate from the main building on the water side of this development. You can see that in the lower right. Teresa, next slide, please. So here's just another elevation with the materials proposed. While the architecture, I would say, and I think the DRB members present would agree, is nice, and it breaks up the mass. The use of materials break up the mass. Next slide, please. But during the conceptual meeting, the DRB again was concerned with the relationship of the and height of the building to the property line, and what the adjacent building would look like, and how that would be mitigated. So they requested during final review a study of the proposed building with the angled setbacks, and you can see this here on the right-hand side. I'm sorry, the left-hand side, excuse me. Next slide, please. Another of the projects was 55 Gardner. It's the old Christian Academy site. You can see this, you can see 278 at the top of your screen. Gardner kind of snakes its way across the middle, and at the very bottom left, you can see a leg of mutton coming in there. The site is in red. Does everybody understand where we are? And if not, let me know. Okay, next slide, please. This is a site plan for 55 Gardner. It's important to note that the building in the upper left-hand corner is 4-story, as well as the building along the plan north, the top property line, is also 4-story, with 3-story buildings closest to the single-family development or single-family neighborhoods at the bottom of the screen. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, Teresa, can you go back? Okay, I meant to point out during the DRB discussion, of concern was the height of the building there at Gardner, and the relationship that would have to the building. Again, you can see there's some parking coming in, and the building does step back, but it's that elevation there closest to the entrance and Gardner. Thank you, Teresa. Next slide, please. So these are just some general elevations of the proposed buildings. Next slide, please. And this is an aerial illustration of the development. Again, here you can see how the buildings on the right-hand side step down to 3 stories, and the ones on the left-hand side are 4 stories, especially the one that comes out to Gardner, which is in the lower left-hand corner. Next slide, please. Again, during the discussion, the conceptual discussion, the DRB was concerned with this, the relationship and height of the building and the relationship to the road, and requested for final a study of that relationship and the setback angle. And this is what was provided. Next slide, please. The next project we're going to look at is Wimbledon Court. It's the old tennis courts for Palmetto Dunes, and it backs up to Folly Field. So you see Folly Field running from the upper right-hand corner to the lower left-hand corner across your screen. In the lower right-hand corner is the ocean. You can pick up the Barony, Marriott Barony in the upper right-hand corner, and Island Club is directly between the site, which is in red, and the ocean. Does anybody not know where we are?
The only correction I would make, Chris, to that is it's not Palmetto Dunes, it's Port Royal.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm sorry.
No problem.
Teresa, next slide, please. So here's a site plan of the proposed development. You can see the buildings and the distance between them and their relationship to the road. Of concern in the DRB discussion was the height of the buildings, again, in relationship to each other as well as the road. And Teresa, next slide, please. And here you can see those elevations, those buildings, those proposed elevations. Teresa, next slide, please. Again, the DRB was concerned about the relationship to the streetscape and requested additional studies and additional plantings along in that buffer to mitigate the buildings from the street. And this is that study with the additional plantings. Teresa, next slide, please. Of more recent concern and recently completed is the boathouse on Squire Pope. The site is outlined in red. It was just the addition to the front of that building. You can see the circle at the end of Gumtree in the lower left-hand corner and Squire Pope running up through the middle of the screen towards the back gate of Hilton Head Plantation. Does everybody know where we are? Okay. Teresa, next slide, please. So this was the addition towards the road of the boathouse. So you can see the line where the existing building is. It's kind of a hatched, I'm sorry, I don't have a pointer. It's kind of a hatched line, heavy line. And everything forward of that towards the street represents the new building that was proposed and built. You can see the parking in front of that building and Squire Pope in front of that. Next slide, please. And these are the elevations. Again, from the DRB discussion, I think the elevations probably broke up the building as best it could, but it is a big building, and the height of the building with relations to the street was of issue for the design review board. I believe that's it, Teresa, but is that it?
Yes, that's all, Chris.
Okay. Again, all I wanted to do was sort of set the context for this discussion. If there is any questions, if there are any questions of me, I'm happy to answer them. But again, I'm not here to put words in the DRB's mouth. We have the chair and the vice chair here to speak.
Does anyone on the Public Planning Committee have a question of Chris? No? All right. Then why don't we, is there anything that either Michael or Kathy would like to say before we begin our conversation? We would certainly welcome your comments. Go ahead, Michael.
Thanks, David, Mr. Chairman. My name is Michael Gentleman. I'm the current chair of the Design Review Board, and I've been in service, I'm guessing 5 years, if I had to guess, maybe a little bit more. And Chris, was everyone, I think the answer is yes, but was everyone provided with a copy of the letter that we wrote?
Yes.
Okay. We just have noticed over the past few years, these special instances, I'd say 9 out of 10 projects that come through are fine. No qualms. Everybody, works with us to a degree. But a 2-story building is a lot easier to control from an island character point of view than a 4 and 5-story building. And the very basis of it is we on the Hilton Head design review, when it comes to island character and 4 and 5-story buildings, our hands are tied. And there's not really much we can do about it other than encourage the applicants to maybe take a story off or break up the facade. We can enforce colors and materials and landscaping, but building heights we have no control over whatsoever. And a couple of these were really out of control when you weigh it against our charge to enforce island character. Now, island character is a very broad term, but some of these aren't it. If what is island character? You know it when you see it, I guess is the best is the best way to explain it. It can go back as far as Charles Frazier's charge for sea pines, where you should live below the tree lines and architecture should be background. But with all that said, we don't really have a true authority to enforce against buildings like these. And I had put in my letter that to different degrees, the applicants did work with us. Some didn't, and some did. So really, we're just throwing the question out there is should the DRB have more influence or more power? And should the LMO be revisited to address buildings like this? And then we had a few recommendations at the end of the letter, one of which was to include an interior buffer within the site. And we had a session with the LMO committee, I believe it was last week or the week prior, and they had made a motion at their meeting to investigate some of these items. So if Kathy would like to add anything.
First of all, Mr. Chairman, I would like to thank you for your introduction to the process. I have a friend who was also on that LMO rewrite committee, and when he saw the article in the paper and then he had to, of course, ask me what was going on, he told me the exact same thing. I think that what you can see is that those LMO rewrites did bring on some investment property, and we developed and are developing the island, and I have the utmost respect for the fact that that was the intention behind it. I just think that there's a step where we can back up a little bit on those LMO regulations so that the DRB and the LMO are working together. A lot of times the LMO requirements, the investors and the developers come in and they get a full impact from everything they can out of those LMO requirements. And such as Gardner, the apartment buildings, we suggested that they take that 4-foot story building that's right up against the street and at least knock that down to 3 stories and step it back up. And they said, if we have to get rid of any apartments, it's not worth us doing the project. So what we have to do is make the LMO requirements such that developers can come in and develop, but also so that the DRB can meet some of our island character in those buildings. Also, when you saw some of the photos and you see that angle setback on especially Mitchellville and the boathouse, there is no room for plantings on the side or in the front. And the setbacks don't allow for any sunlight to even get to those. And part of our DRB requirements are that we kind of help the facade of the building with vegetation. And if we can't even get vegetation to grow, we're in trouble. I live in a really small private community, but the houses are very close together, and the original ARB things asked that everyone put sod and plantings between the houses, and they've discovered that there's nothing can grow in between them because there's no sunlight coming in. And if you looked at Mitchellville, and if you had someone build a building right next to that on each side, there's no way anything's gonna grow. That's my 2 cents for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions of staff or Michael or Kathy? Tammy?
Well, first, I want to thank everyone for this conversation. It's a conversation that I think had started probably right after the LMO rewrite ordinances started taking effect, and the impacts were becoming obvious and known. And so this has been a conversation that didn't just start now, but it's been happening. And I think it's wonderful, to say the least, that we are now all coming together to address these issues. I have the good fortune of having my time free enough to be able to sit in on a lot of meetings, and I try, and I think I've made almost all of y'all's DRB meetings, and I know for a fact that you are conscientious with regard not to just following the DRB guidelines, but how you view things that you don't have that type of control over. And I have heard the suggestions and the rebuttals when they've been made, and how frustrating it is. So I welcome this opportunity. For one, I believe wholeheartedly that we need to be placing more restrictions on the height, and the height specifically as it's related to what's able to happen around the building. As Kathy correctly pointed out, the purpose of our LMO and our design is to create a natural inhabitant and to provide air and space, and we're not doing that. And so those ordinances that prevent that from happening need to be changed, and ones that will specifically allow that to happen need to be written and codified into our scheme of how we want our community to look. So I have a lot of specifics that I'm happy to participate in as this moves forward, but I'm going to let some other folks talk. But I think we are on the right page, and we should be moving together to fix some of these issues. And hopefully that'll be helpful to y'all as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Tammy. Glenn, do you have questions of Michael or Kathy or
I guess
Chris?
I have questions and comments. First, I am not an architect. I am not a design person. So bear with me if I say some things that don't make a lot of sense to an architect and to someone that is professional in this area. What I'm hearing in your comments is, the primary thing I'm hearing is that the mass of a multi-story building, more than 2 stories, is too large to fit island character. Is that a fair way to state that?
Well, that's a little bit of a broad statement. No, I think there's certain places on the island where a 4-story building is totally appropriate. Go down to Coligny or Shelter Cove. There can be concentrated areas on the island that are slightly more urban, I guess. And the island has a lot of 4-story buildings. They're just kind of nestled in the environment. It's when you go into Mitchellville where nothing is over 2 stories or has been, and put in a 5-story building, and it's immediately out of character with the neighborhood right there. And that's written in our design guideline that a building should be within the character of the neighborhood in which it sits. And therefore, that one was easy to pick on because it looked like nothing else in Mitchellville. But the LMO says they can do it. So it's a losing battle for us. It's not, like I said, a 3 and a 4-story building can work on the island. A 5-story building could work on the island if it's in the right place, if it has the right amount of area around it, if we can cover it with trees. And it's so there's not a one size fits all kind of answer to that.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Like Tammy, I sit in on most of your meetings and I see your struggles and I certainly appreciate your hard work. But in that question about, if you will, building size on the front facade, I think about the Ocean Oaks development that you bring up. And that is certainly in an area where high-rise structures are probably more appropriate. And so your objection here is not based so much on mass as it is the fact that it's not broken up, that it is just a shocking wall that's there in front of you. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah, that's a pretty good summary right there.
Go ahead.
That particular one wasn't in our letter that we had written, and that's Chris, what was the time frame on that one? When was that one submitted?
That it had to be 2013, 2014.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that one was before my time or Miss Foss's time. So, but looking at the presentation, yeah, that's a pretty big building, and it's very sheer. The mass wasn't broken up greatly, but if it's down there, and the Holiday Inn is near it, and some other tall buildings, it's not out of context of the neighborhood there, but it's still a big building.
Yeah. And I think about that. I need to write down that way because I compare that to Grand Ocean, the Marriott Grand Ocean, almost next door, which is taller buildings, but somehow they seem to, the structures and improvements seem to scale upward, and the height is in the rear of the building, so you don't have the same appearance of mass, I suppose. You bring up this concept of ocean character, and I understand you're saying you know it when you see it, but I think that it is something that deserves careful definition, probably applying architectural principles and design principles to that, so that you will be armed with the tools that you are seeking here. And I certainly am interested in seeing us make the appropriate changes in the LMO to meet your concerns. I live in Hilton Head Plantation, so I drive by the boathouse frequently, and that is a massive looking warehouse right now, and it's hardly in character with what we call the island character. But I think we need definition on that. On the 55 Gardner Drive property, there we had a lot of negotiation and effort with the developer, which resulted in dropping the height of the buildings that were closest to the adjacent residential development. And so I think we saw a pretty cooperative developer there. I mean, obviously, people don't want to have massive structures, but it was permitted within the LMO. So that came to us in a zoning context, as distinguished from what you're referring to. So that one doesn't bother me as much as Ocean Oaks or the Boathouse. Mention this  project. Obviously, I missed the meeting on that because I find that shocking to see a building of that mass and scale in that virtually undeveloped area. There's nothing like it around. There's nothing that you can compare. I guess the closest thing would be the spa over on Beach City Road, which is 3 or 4 stories, but it's back in the woods, and I would guess it was built before we were ever an island here. So there's not much reference to that. But I don't know what to do about this development on Mitchellville Road. I mean, it seems to me that it is the first card to fall and to drop in starting to see massive development in the Mitchellville area that is out of character with the Mitchellville area, and that's very troubling. So I look forward to working with all of you in this and getting some expertise, receiving some expert advice about the better ways to state these things. So with those comments, again, thank you for sharing your expertise here, and I look forward to making some appropriate changes to define island character. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. Alex?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I appreciate all of the hard work that has gone into bringing us to this point. And I am definitely in support of us trying to clean up to a degree here. I've got a couple of questions. Maybe staff can help me with this. The DRB guidelines, is that an official adopted policy by town council?
Chris, do you want that one?
Is Terry, are you on the line? Okay, the design guide is, before I speak, I'm going to have to clarify that. If you'll give me a minute, I'll get back to you.
Okay, well, let me go on to my next question in case you have to research it also. When was the last time that manual or guideline was revised?
The design guide was revised, I believe, in 2013 or 14. That revision is available on our website.
So
yeah.
I'm assuming we're not sure that if that revision was something that was sanctioned or voted on by council. I'd like to know that along the way also as you're checking on question number 1.
Yes, sir. That's what I'm not sure of. I don't know that town council voted on the design guide and approved it, and I'll have to check that.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Terry.
This is Terry. Sorry, I had to look real quick, just like Chris did. It was adopted. The design guide was adopted by town council in 2015.
Okay. The reason I asked those questions is, I guess, in an effort to clean up here. I understand that there's been a recommendation that we put forth a task force to tackle this. As we're spending the time and the effort to get it right, I just think that there needs to be a comprehensive look at those guidelines versus the LMO to make sure that there are not any other conflicts that we are not yet experiencing, so that we're not having this conversation in another couple of years. Those are my comments, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Alex. Mr. Lennox, do you have anything you would like to add at this time?
No, David. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Tammy, did I see your hand go up? Did you want to say something else?
I didn't raise my hand. I just turned on my microphone, but I do have something that I wanted to follow up on that, and I'm curious. I think I know the answer, but by the time the plans get to the DRB for them to go over, how often, or does it at all? And then how often would be an interesting piece of information to know. Have the setbacks, buffers, and the other discretionary, the officials' discretionary reductions have been made. So what I'm trying to say is, how often do those plans, prior to them getting to the DRB, where they need to ensure that they're following the island character pieces, has it already been that the side setbacks, the angles, et cetera, have been modified by discretion by the official? That would be an important piece to know, because that would go to some of the questions and concerns that we have with regard to, is there sufficient room for plantings, for example? Where is the parking placed, for another? How are the angles falling, the height and the angles, or any architectural details? Those sorts of things have already been decided on, that the DRB loses control over, even at that, when they get it. Does that make sense? Did I make that clear enough? So I'd be interested in knowing how often that happens.
This is Chris. Terry, I don't know if you have those numbers or any more insight, but I would say that very seldom has a buffer or setback been altered by any kind of a variance before it gets to the DRB.
Okay, so not just a variance, though. The other area where we have the opportunity, or the town through the official has the opportunity to make those decisions at that person's discretion without a variance.
Sure. So this is Terry. So you're speaking to the waivers, I believe, where it can be reduced. Certain setbacks and buffers have the opportunity to be reduced. So typically, and I'll ask Chris to jump in here too, with some of these bigger projects that y'all have been looking at today, they go through both a conceptual and then a final review. We do have planning staff that take a look at these as they're going through the process, so that they're not showing something on the site plan to the DRB that then can't get approved when it gets to the DRB. So we wouldn't want them to put a buffer that's too small and then gets to the DRB and then we find out it needs to be changed. So we do have staff that's looking at that. Typically, we don't issue the DPR, which would be the development plan review. We wouldn't issue that until after all of the design review board approvals are received. So there is a chance that they could go to the design review board, get both final or conceptual and final approval, and then go complete their DPR process, and there could be other changes. If they were significant changes, though, let's say that they were able to reduce a buffer and that caused a change to the plantings, that would go back to Chris, and then he would determine whether that would need to go back through the whole design review board.
Okay, so there's continued oversight. If a waiver is permitted after the DRB has already given their approvals, then it starts back over, but it doesn't necessarily go to the board. It is looked at and decided on internally.
Right, it depends on the level of the changes, and certainly Chris and the DRB could both tell you that there are a fair number of things that would go back to the full DRB because the changes are just extensive enough that we feel like that review is needed at that level.
Is there any point when the DRB board becomes aware of those types of changes that have happened after their approvals?
I'm going to need to ask Chris to answer that one.
Yes, the DRB does as they're driving, as any member of the DRB is driving around the island, and Kathy is a good example, because there's one that I'm working on that she brought to my attention. If they're not developed, if there's a development that's not per the DRB approval, then they'll contact me, and I'll note that and seek compliance with the DRB approval.
All right, thank you for those answers. I think it gets a little bit more complex, maybe even, and I'd like to see how that. I think I'll have follow-up questions, and maybe I'll put them in writing so that it's easy to pick up on at our next discussion. Thank you.
Alex.
Yes, I guess just to go a little bit deeper on Councilwoman Becker's comments there, the process that a project would have to follow throughout the various reviews and approvals, is that process just an internal operating process, or is that something that happens by written, official, adopted code?
This is Chris, and again, Terry, I don't want to step on your toes, but I think that's kind of what this discussion is about. Some of the discussion here is where the design guide comes up against the written code of the LMO, and they conflict. So the design review board is looking to preserve island character, and if the LMO is allowing a building that's higher than what the design review board thinks is in keeping with island character, that's where there's a conflict. Does that answer your question?
I'm taking that as a no. There's not an adopted process. It's just something that happens internally. That's where I'm understanding it. I'm just suggesting that as we move forward, that's part of the cleanup. That internal process, I guess, offers the assurance that the design and review board work does line up with the intent of the land management ordinance. I just think that needs to be one of the tasks included.
Alex, the way you stated that, I might flip that we are creating a LMO that reflects our island character, not that we try to change the island character to be consistent with the LMO. I think that's really where we are talking at this point. I see Todd there, and Todd, you haven't had an opportunity to add your thoughts on this matter.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Quickly to answer, and I believe this is correct for Mr. Stanford. I think the Oaks development is different because somewhere during the process, I think there was an allowance for more floors per height of building. So even though that building may be the same height as a Marriott, it's got, I think, one extra floor in there. It makes it look busy. It gives it kind of it's a greater impact, I think. And maybe Michael, I don't know, Michael, if you were on the design review board at the time reviewing that, but just looking at the elevations, there's an extra floor in there, so there's a lot more going on with the facade of the building. So I think that's why that one stands out even more so. Obviously, there's an impact. In the past, it's been brought up about the ocean side as well as the street side of that development. And I think some of the question that was going on, and I was thinking about this, is one of the elements that may be missing that may address Councilman Brown's question is in a lot of cases, these developments first go to the town as a pre-application. And that's to sort of, sit down with town staff and get some input on guidance. And a lot of times I think that happens before they ever go to design review board. and maybe that's part of the missing link, is that there isn't an interface there where design review board members have an opportunity to participate in that meeting, is one thought. Because typically that's done, and then things start to move ahead, and a lot of times after that meeting, then there's the conceptual design review board submittal, and by that time, the development team is already starting down the road with their work and stuff.
Yeah.
I appreciate that comment. That makes sense to me. But I think it's even more substantial than that. But before I get into that, Michael, what is an interior buffer?
We suggested from the board that in order to soften a facade of a building, you want to get landscaping up next to it. And a lot of times things are given to us where the parking lot or the sidewalk butts right up against the building. We're trying to avoid that. So our suggestion was for a one-story building, you have a 3-foot green strip between any hardscape, sidewalk, parking lot, and the building. And if it's a 2-story building, it might be 5 feet. And if it's a 3-story building, it might be 7 feet, and so on.
Okay.
And the reason for that is you can see in some of these illustrations that they'll put plantings up against a 5-story building that does absolutely no good. A, it'll die, like Ms. Foss pointed out earlier, and B, it does nothing,
Okay,
for the building. So
I was thrown off by the word interior. So this is could be the facade of a building facing the road, but you're talking about the adjacency to the building itself.
yeah, for instance, right now there are side buffers that you have to plant and landscape. But if someone runs a parking lot, say the parking lot's in front, and the parking lot runs all the way up to the building, you got this huge desert of asphalt or gravel or whatever with nothing to soften it. And then that's where we would think, there should be an 8-foot strip there to landscape it, allow you to at least get some human scale trees in there. So
Got it. Let me bring up one other historical item that relates to the 2014 rewrite effort. Near the end of that process, and it was a long process, the Native Islanders came and said, "What about us?" And the LMO rewrite committee had been told at the outset we weren't going to deal with Ward 1. We were dealing primarily with the higher density areas of the island. And right near the end of the effort, the committee decided to try to do something to recognize an opportunity for Native Islanders and created 5 initiative areas. One of those initiative areas was Mitchellville. The idea was that the town would look at the Mitchellville area, master plan it in a way that it had some sort of cohesive theme that would benefit the landowners and more or less guide the development in that area. And as a part of that, it was upzoned from virtually no dwelling units per acre. I don't remember whether it was 4 dwelling units per acre or what, to basically a resort density. The problem is the town never did a master plan. So now we have this Mitchellville development with a higher density without a master plan. And so we ended up in a place that nobody wanted to end up without a plan. And I think now we're maybe paying the piper, but that's something that this process might want to look into. The second item that I just bring out as an extraneous item perhaps is that we always thought that Hilton Head was shrouded in trees. And as the flood elevations began to influence first floor elevations, the buildings got taller and taller. And when the LMO rewrite committee said 75 feet in the resort areas, they were even taller. And so we have, in effect, lost that connection to our natural environment that was so important to us in establishing the character of the community. I don't have an answer to this question. I'll just ask it and it can be answered at some point. Was it a federal government legal requirement that we had to establish first floor elevation, the start of our building heights at flood elevation? And whether or not that is an issue that in this process could be reviewed. I don't have an answer to that question. We don't have to think about it at the moment. But in effect, we've added an extra 15 feet to a 75-foot building in some cases. That's clearly higher than any kind of island character comments that are in the guidelines. So that's an issue that we can talk about at some further date. I'd like to look at this in a slightly different way. Yeah, it's all about aesthetics, but I think it's significantly more than that. It's economic, it's financial, and it's environmental. What do I mean by that? If you take our zoning ordinance and you have planes, vertical planes, that start where a building can begin on setbacks and front back sight lines and so on, and you project that volume up to its maximum height, a developer is going to calculate the value and potential of that site based on that volume. And so his plans and expectations are going to be based on that simple equation of volume. That impacts neighborhood, it impacts land values, it impacts downstream tax appraisals. And so all of a sudden, if you look at the LMO as a three-dimensional equation, you begin to understand why the DRB is having such a difficult time. And if you think about it just a little bit further, what we are doing with the LMO is giving developers the opportunity to make more money at the community's expense because we haven't established that volume that's consistent with island character. And so I think that is sort of the fundamental inconsistency that we have. And I just think that that's an area that this process should look into.
David, can I add to that without breaking your train of thought?
Go ahead.
It's interesting because it kind of it folds together with other conversations that I think we're having at this point too. We talk about DRB, and this now we're talking largely about commercial buildings. And your equation that you just described is quite accurate, but it doesn't just stop at commercial buildings. The development that is happening within residential neighborhoods that ought to be single-family homes, but are in fact nothing more than commercial buildings because they're never occupied as a single-family home, but immediately rented as many weeks as possible throughout the year. And so much of what you've said, much of what we're concerned about here with this meeting also refers itself easily into those single-family commercial buildings that are making their way into every one of our neighborhoods, both behind and outside the gates. And there is many numbers of people who are beginning to realize that we are heading down a path that no one wants to be on. And so I think as we talk about this and we talk about commercial buildings, we need to also talk about that.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with that. It's interesting. The island character in modern development terms was about 1 dwelling unit per acre. Sea Pines, Hilton Head Plantation, Shipyard, Palmetto Dunes, all roughly 1 dwelling unit per acre. But they weren't acre lot here, acre lot there. They were master planned. Harbor Town's about 22 dwelling units per acre. So density isn't the problem. It's the lack of planning that gets us to a point we want to arrive. And so I think that this exercise, this process that we're talking about, really depends on understanding almost district by district the character we're trying to preserve. And so it's much more complicated, I think, than simply aesthetics. It has to do with how we're going to protect our environment, how we're going to deal with the economics of land values downstream, and so on and so forth. And two last comments. I think one of our challenges is the continuous change in perceptions and preferences, and that there's going to be a continuous rethinking of what island character is. And when I drive into Harbor Town at this point and I see buildings that are brightly colored, I say, okay, maybe not. How did they get approved and so on? I know the story. So that's clearly a change. And at some point, island character may be somewhat redefined. But I think in order to redefine it, we absolutely have to have plans that we rest those guidelines upon. And we haven't done that. Tom, I see you raising your hand. Welcome.
Thank you, David. I've got a copy of the Town of Hilton Head Island design guide in front of me, and on page 2, there is an island character vision statement, and it is very, very well written. And that may go a long way in helping define what island character is. And then on page 3, it branches into elements of that character and how development should be directed. And equally, that's very, very well done. I don't know whether this is something that could be accomplished, but to the extent that we could link the LMO as an ordinance to the design guide by saying these requirements under this ordinance pertaining to land management shall be consistent with the town's then current planning guide. I think that planning guide is good enough to really do a lot of what you're talking about.
Michael and Kathy, what is your response to that?
I agree. But the LMO is very specific, whereas the design guide is more broad. So I agree that island character is defined, but it's not enforceable is the big problem. And the repercussions are everything that David said. It's not just aesthetics, it's environmental, it's trees not growing, it's cutting trees down, it's surface erosion. It goes beyond aesthetics. But the whole big point of where this started with us was the kind of the missed little link, the miscoordination that Mr. Brown had brought up. Do they say the same thing? And two, do we have authority to fix it? And at what point do we have authority to fix it? I don't blame any developers for trying to maximize their property. That's what they do. And I think as a board overall, we're very pro business. Somebody comes in the door, we help them get their building out the door, but we don't do it at the expense of what our mission is, and that's to enforce island character. So it's a big spinning wheel, you know. Go ahead,
And you can only,
Kathy.
yeah, go ahead.
Kathy?
You brought up a good point about the districts on the island. The character should be written for those districts. The DRB came up with this more than a year ago, and we presented it to the LMO, our concerns, and then the pandemic hit, and that got tabled until we've just now brought it up. And Mitchellville, that one came in during the pandemic and is what really started scaring us. Mitchellville, I understand why you guys thought to let the development happen in Mitchellville with the LMO, but one of the things that is aesthetic and island about Mitchellville is it is the only place that a non-homeowner and a non-beach owner can go and see what the island looks like in its natural habitat, undisturbed. It's a beautiful piece of the island. And so that building coming in really did sort of spoil the way we were thinking about it. Also, one of the things to think of in the future, and Michael brought it up in that it is in the guidelines that the buildings that come in need to work with their environment, not just natural environment, the buildings around it. And I just hope there's some way to take back that precedent that we set with this 5-story high Mitchellville building.
Thank you, Kathy. The reason we're meeting today is to give staff an indication by members of council whether or not this is a direction that we ought to pursue. Glenn.
Thank you. Again, I want to express appreciation to these two members of the DRB for focusing us on this. I want to see us move it forward. The recommendation in the letter, as I see it, is to push this forward to the Planning Commission. David, I'm wondering if this doesn't call for a task force made up of members of the DRB, other design experts, as well as legal experts who can deal with crafting these documents so they do operate together as one. We've covered a lot of really good points here, but I don't want to lose the expertise of these two folks by moving it forward to the Planning Commission, which has this as a concern, but many other things as a concern as well. That's just a thought.
Okay, thank you. Todd?
Thank you. Glenn, I don't know if you saw our LMO committee met earlier and made that recommendation that we agree. We felt like there's a disconnect between the LMO and the design guidelines, and that needs to be worked out. Also agreed, that there's some there needs to be a serious look into some of these districts and what the ordinances allow and that sort of thing. But the LMO committee made a recommendation to establish that task force that's made up of a group of different expertise, staff, design review board, and all that, to really weigh in and really kind of make sure that we don't end up with a domino effect as well, that we really think this through. And, to David's point, at what level does a planning perspective come into this, sort of a master plan of some of these areas? But we were in agreement with the design review board's recommendations on the 2 items, and we thought the 3rd item, which was the buffers between buildings and internal buffers, could be moved a little quicker, and that could be addressed at a staff level and LMO committee, we require green space between parking spaces, but we don't do it between the parking and the building. So, I mean, that seems, like a no-brainer to address that.
Thank you, Todd. I think that's probably where I got the idea from about a task force.
Okay, to wrap up, any further comments by individual members of the Public Planning Committee?
I have one question, and I think, Michael, you made a good point. During those pre-app meetings, y'all's presence, someone from your board, I think would be a really important seat for you to have at the table. I am also curious, when do developers get a copy, or do they get a copy even, of the guidelines? Or is there any information on that? So when somebody comes in for an application, to me it would seem, okay, you've given us an application, thank you, we're so happy to have you, blah, blah, blah. Here's X, Y, and Z, please take these with it. It's a packet of information. You'll need it as we proceed. Is in that packet of information the DRB guideline handbook?
This is Chris. During the pre-app review, generally I will make comments that a major or minor DRB is needed, and in those comments, I'll point them towards the design guide.
I think that Mr. Lennox's suggestion is relevant to this conversation. There may have to be something in the process or in the language that makes that a stronger connection. All right, any other further thoughts? I'd like to wrap it up if possible. Glenn made a suggestion about a task force. I think the first question is, by consensus, does this committee believe that this is something that we recommend to staff and the LMO committee to pursue as a first step? And then the second part of that would be, if so, do we agree that perhaps a task force, as yet undescribed, it makes sense?
Yes.
On both scores?
Yes.
Alex?
Yeah, I have a question, Mr. Chairman. There's been a lot of discussion here, a lot of great points. I'm just curious to know the path forward. If we give consensus, are the items that we have discussed, essentially there may be, in addition to what the LMO committee is suggesting, going to be captured?
Well, I think we are giving direction to staff that we want to pursue this, get back to us on how this is going to play out. And I think the LMO Planning Commission plays a role in that.
So as far as the direction is concerned, are you suggesting that in a future meeting, we'll have another bite at the apple to make sure that everything that we have presented today has been captured before we pitch it back downstream to LMO committee? Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, I think, I would lean on Teresa to consolidate in the minutes what has been discussed today. And then at our next meeting, we can confirm that it's comprehensive or not.
Absolutely.
Yes, Glenn. Yes, Glenn.
David, I want to say that I agree with you on both points. We should move forward in those two directions.
Thank you, Glenn. Tammy, I see you nodding. I want to thank Todd again, and Michael and Kathy for spending an hour or two with us. Very important input. Michael, again, I want to just note your leadership in the DRB. I've watched a number of those meetings. I think you handle it very well, and I think the entire board is very professional, and I think I give you guys a gold star. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And Chris, thanks for the briefing. If there is no further business, there are no committee reports, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Is there a second? Okay,
Yes,
all
sir.
those in favor, right hand. Thank you very much. Adjourn.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.